In 1978, a 9-year-old boy walked into Henderson's Corner Store in Blackridge, Kentucky, to buy candy with the quarters his grandmother had given him for good grades. Mark Fulton never made it home. The town searched every mine shaft, every tunnel, every abandoned building in their small coal mining community. They found nothing. 46 years later, when construction crews broke through the concrete seal of an old maintenance tunnel beneath the Riverside mine, they discovered Mark's blue jacket still folded neatly beside a rusted lunch pail. Inside that pail were tools engraved with a name that made investigators' blood run cold: Dale Rucker. The same Dale Rucker who had volunteered for every search party in 1978. The same Dale Rucker who had comforted Mark's mother at community vigils. The same Dale Rucker who had died in 1993, taking his secrets to the grave, or so everyone thought. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of October 14th, 1978, began like any other Saturday in Blackridge, Kentucky. Mark Fulton woke to the smell of his grandmother's biscuits wafting through the small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. His mother, Jennifer Fulton, had already left for her shift at the diner, her third job that month, trying to keep food on the table after Mark's father had walked out 2 years prior. Mark's grandmother, Ruth Hendricks, had moved in to help raise the boy, and she doted on him with the fierce love that grandmothers reserve for their only grandchildren. Mark had brought home straight A's on his report card the day before, something that filled Ruth with such pride she could barely contain herself. She had promised him 2 quarters, a small fortune for a 9-year-old in 1978, enough to buy candy at Henderson's Corner Store and still have change left over. The boy had talked about nothing else all morning, listing the candy he would buy, changing his mind every few minutes between chocolate bars and lemon drops and licorice whips. Ruth watched him eat his breakfast, noting how his dark hair fell across his forehead in that way that reminded her so much of her late husband. Mark had the same serious brown eyes, the same thoughtful expression when he was thinking hard about something. He was small for his age, slight and wiry, but what he lacked in size he made up for in intelligence and kindness. Teachers at Blackridge Elementary loved him. Other kids sought him out at recess. He was the type of child who noticed when someone was sitting alone and went over to keep them company. After breakfast, Mark pulled on his favorite blue jacket, the one with the yellow stripes on the sleeves that his mother had bought him from the Sears catalog. He kissed his grandmother on the cheek and promised to be back in 30 minutes. Henderson's Corner Store was only 4 blocks away, an easy walk down quiet streets where everyone knew everyone else's business. Ruth stood on the porch and watched him skip down the sidewalk, his quarters clutched tight in his fist. She would replay that moment in her mind for the rest of her life, watching his small figure grow smaller as he rounded the corner onto Main Street. She would remember the sunshine, unseasonably warm for October. She would remember the yellow leaves falling from the maple trees. She would remember feeling happy, feeling blessed, feeling like everything in their hard-luck lives was finally starting to turn around. Henderson's Corner Store sat at the intersection of Main Street and Cole Avenue, a weathered brick building that had served Blackridge since the 1920s. Old Jim Henderson ran it with his wife, May, and they knew every kid in town by name. The store was crowded that morning, busier than usual, because the mine had just paid out, and men were buying cigarettes and beer and lottery tickets, hoping to stretch their meager paychecks just a little bit further. Jim Henderson would later tell police that Mark came in around 10:15 in the morning. The boy was polite as always, waiting his turn in line, even though May had offered to help him right away. When he finally reached the counter, he carefully counted out his 2 quarters and asked for penny candy, filling a small brown bag with Jawbreakers and Tootsie Rolls and Mary Janes. Jim remembered giving him back 8 cents in change and remembered Mark thanking him before heading toward the door. 3 other witnesses saw Mark leave the store. Betty Crawford was sweeping her front porch across the street and waved to the boy. Dale Rucker was coming out of the hardware store next door and held the door open for Mark, ruffling his hair in that friendly way adults sometimes do with kids. Linda Walsh was driving past and noticed Mark because her own son was friends with him from school. All 3 witnesses would be questioned extensively in the days to come, their memories picked apart and analyzed for any detail that might help. Mark never made it home. When 30 minutes passed and then an hour, Ruth began to worry. When 2 hours passed, she called her daughter at the diner. Jennifer left work immediately, and the 2 women began walking Mark's route, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen him. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Sheriff Clayton Burke had been called, and the official search began. Blackridge was a town where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. The concept that something terrible could happen to a child in broad daylight on a Saturday morning seemed impossible, unthinkable. But as the afternoon wore into evening and evening into night, The impossible became the terrifying reality they all had to face. Sheriff Burke organized search parties immediately. Within hours, half the town had turned out to help. Men came straight from the mines, still covered in coal dust, to search every alley and backyard. Women brought flashlights and thermoses of coffee. The fire department arrived with searchlights. Dogs were brought in to track Mark's scent, but they lost the trail 3 blocks from Henderson's store, near the old entrance to the Riverside mine. The mine loomed over Blackridge like a sleeping giant. It had been the lifeblood of the town since 1923, employing 3 generations of men who dug coal from the earth and sent it off to power plants across the eastern United States. The main operations had moved to a newer facility 2 miles away in 1974, but the old Riverside site was still used for storage and maintenance. Miles of tunnels snaked beneath the town, some sealed off, some still accessible, all of them dangerous. The possibility that Mark had somehow wandered into the mine system became the focus of the investigation. Sheriff Burke brought in mine safety experts from the state capitol. They mapped out every tunnel, every shaft, every point of entry within a 5-mile radius. Teams of experienced miners volunteered to search underground, risking their own safety to crawl through narrow passages and unstable tunnels. They found nothing. Days turned into weeks. Jennifer Fulton's face became a fixture on local television news. She made tearful pleas for information, for anyone who might have seen something to come forward. Ruth stopped eating, stopped sleeping, spent every waking moment either searching or praying, or both. The town rallied around them with casseroles and donated money and promises that they would never give up looking. Dale Rucker was particularly helpful during those terrible weeks. A 38-year-old mine supervisor, he had lived in Blackridge his entire life. He was married to a woman named Carol, and they had 2 daughters, 8 and 6 years old. Dale knew the mine system better than almost anyone, and he volunteered for every underground search. He worked double shifts, spending his days doing his regular job and his evenings crawling through abandoned tunnels with a flashlight and hope. He was the one who suggested they search the sealed maintenance tunnels, areas that had been closed off years earlier due to instability. Sheriff Burke initially dismissed the idea, reasoning that Mark couldn't have accessed sealed areas, but Dale was persistent. He argued that some of the seals might have deteriorated, that a small boy could have squeezed through gaps that adults wouldn't notice. Burke finally agreed to check, but the cursory inspection showed all seals intact. As November arrived and the weather turned cold, the massive search efforts began to wind down. The FBI had been called in and found no evidence of abduction. No suspicious vehicles had been seen. No strangers had been reported in town. No ransom demands ever came. Mark Fulton had simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The case went cold by Christmas. Jennifer and Ruth never gave up hope, but the daily searches stopped. Life in Blackridge slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though the shadow of Mark's disappearance hung over everything. People locked their doors now. Children weren't allowed to walk anywhere alone. The innocence of the small town had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. Years passed. Jennifer never moved from the house on Maple Street, convinced that if Mark ever found his way home, he needed to know where to go. She kept his room exactly as he had left it, his clothes still in the drawers, his schoolbook still on the desk. Ruth passed away in 1986, her heart broken by grief and unanswered questions. On her deathbed, she made Jennifer promise to never stop looking, to never stop believing that someday they would know what happened to Mark. Dale Rucker continued his life in Blackridge. He was promoted to mine manager in 1982 and became a respected figure in the community. He served on the town council and coached Little League baseball. His daughters grew up and moved away to college. He and Carol celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1988. To everyone who knew him, Dale was a good man who had tried his best to help find Mark Fulton and had been as devastated as anyone when the boy was never found. In 1993, Dale Rucker died of a heart attack at the age of 53. The entire town turned out for his funeral. Jennifer Fulton even attended, grateful for how hard Dale had worked to search for her son. She had no idea she was mourning the man who had killed him. The decades continued to roll past. Jennifer remarried in 2001 to a kind man named Robert Chen who had moved to Blackridge to teach at the high school. He helped her carry the burden of not knowing, helped her find moments of peace amid the grief. She became active in organizations for families of missing children, channeling her pain into advocacy and support for others going through similar nightmares. The case file remained open but dormant. New sheriffs came and went, each one taking a fresh look at Mark Fulton's disappearance, each one finding the same dead ends. The evidence was minimal. The witnesses had seen nothing unusual. The searches had been thorough. It was as if Mark had simply ceased to exist the moment he left Henderson's corner store. Technology advanced. DNA testing became routine. Jennifer provided samples, hoping that someday, somehow, they might be useful. She followed every true crime podcast that covered cold cases, every television show about missing children. She joined online forums where amateur detectives discussed unsolved disappearances. She never lost hope that someone, somewhere, might have the piece of information that would finally bring answers. In 2024, the Riverside mine finally shut down for good. Coal was dying as an industry, killed by natural gas and renewable energy, and changing economic realities. The company that owned the mine, Appalachian Resource Group, faced mounting pressure to properly close and remediate the site. Environmental regulations required them to seal all remaining tunnels and ensure no contaminants could leach into the groundwater. A construction crew from Louisville won the contract for the closure work. They spent months mapping the underground system, identifying every tunnel and shaft that needed to be permanently sealed. The project manager, a woman named Rachel Ortiz, was meticulous and thorough. She had worked mine closures across Kentucky and West Virginia and took pride in doing the job right. In early September 2024, Rachel's crew was working in the oldest section of the Riverside mine, the original tunnels from the 1920s. Most of this area had been sealed off decades earlier, but regulations required they verify the integrity of those old seals before signing off on the closure. They used ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging to check the concrete barriers that had been poured across tunnel entrances. One seal in particular caught Rachel's attention. It was in a maintenance tunnel that branched off from the main system, an area that had been used to store equipment and supplies. According to records, it had been sealed in 1977 due to concerns about roof stability, but the radar was showing unusual readings behind the seal, suggesting voids and possibly metal objects. Rachel made the decision to break through the seal and verify what was behind it. On September 18, 2024, her crew used jackhammers to carefully remove the concrete barrier. As the seal came down, cool air rushed out, carrying the smell of damp earth and rust and something else, something that made the workers step back in alarm. Behind the seal, the tunnel extended about 40 feet before ending in a collapse. The roof had partially caved in at some point, filling the passage with rubble and broken timbers. But in the first section of the tunnel, illuminated by the workers' headlamps, was a scene that had been hidden for 46 years. Against the wall, placed with eerie care, was a small blue jacket with yellow stripes on the sleeves. Next to it sat a rusted metal lunch pail, the kind miners carried into the shafts every day. A rotted canvas top covered something on the ground, something small and heartbreaking. Rachel Ortiz immediately stopped work and called the Kentucky State Police. Detective Marcus Webb arrived within 2 hours. He was a 20-year veteran of the state police, specializing in cold cases and forensic investigation. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel and felt the weight of what he was looking at settle on his shoulders. This was the kind of scene that haunted investigators, the kind that proved evil could hide in plain sight for decades. The forensic team worked through the night, carefully documenting everything before anything was moved. Photographers captured every angle. The medical examiner carefully examined the remains found beneath the tarp. The blue jacket was bagged as evidence, and when they checked the label inside, it showed it had been purchased from Sears. The lunch pail was carefully opened, revealing tools inside. Engraved on each tool was a name: D. Rucker. Detective Webb ran the name through the database and found the connection immediately. Dale Rucker, deceased 1993, had been a mine supervisor in 1978. He had been one of the volunteers who searched for Mark Fulton. He had access to every tunnel in the Riverside mine, and he had apparently sealed his crime behind concrete, believing it would stay hidden forever. Jennifer Chen, formerly Jennifer Fulton, was 63 years old when Detective Webb knocked on her door. She knew immediately why he had come. After 46 years of waiting, a mother develops an instinct for the moment when the waiting ends. She invited him in, called her husband to come home from work, and sat down to finally learn what had happened to her son. Webb was gentle but direct. He explained about the tunnel, about the jacket, about the lunch pail with Dale Rucker's name. He explained that dental records would need to confirm identity, but given the location and evidence, there was no doubt. Mark Fulton had been found. He had been murdered and hidden by a man the entire community had trusted, a man who had looked Jennifer in the eye at search parties and vigils, and had lied with every breath. Jennifer's reaction surprised Webb. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she sat very still and very quiet, processing information her brain had both expected and refused to believe for more than 4 decades. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Why? Why had Dale Rucker killed her 9-year-old son? That question would take weeks to answer. Detective Webb assembled a team to investigate Dale Rucker's life, to search for any explanation that might make sense of the senseless. They interviewed everyone who had known him. They obtained warrants to search the home where his widow, Carol, still lived. They dug through boxes of his personal effects that had been stored in her attic for 30 years. What they found painted a picture of a man with dark secrets. In a locked metal box, hidden beneath old Christmas decorations, they found photographs. Not of Dale's family or friends, but of children, young boys, all between the ages of 8 and 10. Some were school photos that appeared to have been taken from yearbooks. Others were candid shots taken from a distance, boys playing in parks or walking home from school. None showed anything overtly sexual or violent, but the collection itself was deeply disturbing. Beneath the photographs was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. Dale had kept sporadic entries over the years, cryptic notes that seemed to reference his attraction to young boys. He wrote about struggling with urges he knew were wrong. He wrote about trying to be normal, to be a good husband and father, to suppress the darkness he felt inside. And he wrote about October 14th, 1978. The entry was dated October 15th, the day after Mark disappeared. Dale's handwriting was shaky, the words blotted here and there, as if he had been crying while writing. He confessed to seeing Mark leave Henderson's store and following him. He confessed to calling out to the boy, offering to give him a ride home. Mark had known Dale from seeing him around town and hadn't been afraid. He had gotten into Dale's truck. Dale wrote that he had driven Mark to the old Riverside mine site, telling the boy he wanted to show him something interesting in one of the tunnels. Mark had been excited, curious about the mine the way many boys in Blackridge were. They had gone into the maintenance tunnel together, and there, in the darkness, Dale's self-control had shattered. The journal didn't go into graphic detail, and for that small mercy, investigators were grateful. But Dale had written enough to make clear that he had assaulted Mark, and then, in panic and shame, had killed him to silence the only witness to his crime. He had hidden the body deep in the tunnel, covered it carefully, and then gone home to his family. The next day, he had been one of the first to volunteer for the search, driven by guilt and the desperate need to control the narrative, to make sure no one ever looked too carefully in his direction. Over the following weeks, Dale had carefully planned his cover-up. He had volunteered for every search specifically so he could be present when the sealed tunnels were being checked. He had suggested they focus on areas far from where Mark actually was. And then, when he had found the opportunity, he had used his position as mine supervisor to arrange for the maintenance tunnel to be sealed, citing roof instability. He had poured the concrete himself, working a weekend shift when no one else was around, permanently entombing the evidence of his crime. The journal entries continued sporadically through the years. Dale wrote about the guilt that ate at him, about nightmares where Mark's face appeared. He wrote about seeing Jennifer Fulton around town and feeling physically sick with remorse. But he also wrote about relief that he had never been caught, gratitude that his family never had to know what he really was. The last entry was dated June 1993, just a month before his death. In it, Dale wrote that he believed he would take his secret to the grave, that God might forgive him even if people never could. When Detective Webb presented his findings to Jennifer, she listened with the same eerie calm she had shown when first learning of Mark's discovery. Robert held her hand as Webb walked through the evidence, explaining how Dale had manipulated the search, how he had hidden in plain sight, how he had even attended Dale's funeral without knowing she was standing next to her son's killer. After Webb finished, Jennifer sat in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears finally streaming down her face. She said she was grateful to finally know. Grateful that Mark hadn't suffered his whole life in some dungeon or been sold into trafficking like she had feared in her darkest moments. Grateful that his suffering had been relatively brief, though the thought of it still tore her apart. Grateful that his body had been found so she could finally lay him to rest with the dignity he deserved. She said she forgave Dale Rucker because holding on to hate would only continue to poison her life. She said she pitied him for the torment he must have felt, even while acknowledging that his torment was nothing compared to what Mark had endured or what her family had lived through for 46 years. She said she hoped he was facing judgment now in whatever came after death, but that judgment wasn't her responsibility anymore. The story broke nationally. Mark Fulton's case had been a footnote in Kentucky crime history, but the resolution brought renewed attention. Media from across the country descended on Blackridge to cover the discovery. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to analyzing how Dale Rucker had gotten away with murder for so long. Criminologists studied the case as an example of how child predators often hide in positions of trust and authority. Carol Rucker, Dale's widow, was devastated by the revelations. She had lived 71 years believing her late husband was a good man. Now, at an age when she should have been enjoying retirement and grandchildren, she was facing the reality that she had shared a bed with a child killer. Her daughters, both middle-aged women with families of their own, struggled to reconcile their memories of a loving father with the monster his journal revealed. In a courageous move, Carol reached out to Jennifer and asked if they could meet. Jennifer agreed, and the two women sat together in Jennifer's living room, both victims of Dale Rucker in different ways. Carol apologized for not seeing the signs, for not somehow stopping what happened. Jennifer assured her that Dale had fooled everyone, that his deception was not Carol's fault. They cried together, two women connected by tragedy, trying to find some way forward through the darkness. Mark Fulton was finally laid to rest on November 9, 2024, exactly 46 years and 26 days after he disappeared. The funeral was held at Black Ridge Community Church, the same church where prayer vigils had been held in 1978. The building was packed with people who had never known Mark but felt connected to his story, people who had followed the case and wanted to bear witness to his homecoming. Jennifer gave a eulogy that left no dry eyes in the church. She spoke about the bright, kind, intelligent boy Mark had been. She spoke about the life he never got to live, the graduations and weddings and children he never got to experience. She spoke about carrying him in her heart for 46 years, never letting go of the love a mother has for her child, and she spoke about finally being able to say goodbye, about finally being able to give him the burial he deserved. Mark was buried next to his grandmother Ruth, who had died, still not knowing what happened to him. Jennifer took comfort in believing they were together now, that Ruth could hold her grandson again, and that Mark knew how hard she had fought to find him. The headstone was simple but powerful. Mark Fulton, 1969 to 1978, forever loved, never forgotten, finally home. In the weeks after the funeral, Jennifer worked with the Kentucky State Police to close out the case officially. Detective Webb presented her with the blue jacket, cleaned and preserved as much as possible. She held it against her chest and smelled it, hoping for some trace of Mark after all these years, but there was only the smell of earth and time. She placed it in a memory box along with Mark's report card, his school photos, and the letters Ruth had written to him every birthday after he disappeared, letters she had never mailed because there was nowhere to send them. The Riverside mine closure continued. Rachel Ortiz and her crew completed the remediation work by December 2024, ensuring that every tunnel was properly sealed and that the site was safe and stable. A historical marker was placed at the entrance to commemorate the mine's 100-year history and the generations of workers who had labored in its depths. No mention was made of what had been found in the maintenance tunnel. Some things didn't need to be memorialized with brass plaques. Black Ridge slowly processed the revelation that a child killer had lived among them for 15 years after his crime. Town meetings were held to discuss how such a thing could have happened, how Dale Rucker had managed to deflect suspicion so effectively. Some people expressed anger at the original investigation, questioning why the sealed tunnels hadn't been more thoroughly examined. Sheriff Burke, long retired, issued a statement, saying that with 1978 investigative techniques, they had done everything they knew to do, but acknowledged that Dale's insider knowledge had given him an advantage they couldn't overcome. The case prompted changes in how missing children investigations were conducted. Kentucky passed legislation requiring that all potential hiding places in industrial sites be thoroughly checked during search operations, even if access seemed impossible. Training programs for law enforcement were updated to include information about how predators use positions of authority to manipulate investigations. Mark's name became attached to protocols designed to prevent his tragedy from happening to another child. Jennifer Chen continued her advocacy work with renewed purpose. She spoke at conferences about the importance of never giving up on cold cases, about how advances in technology and changes in personnel could bring new perspectives to old mysteries. She pushed for funding to investigate other unsolved disappearances, particularly cases from the 1970s and 80s that had gone cold before modern forensic techniques were available. In the spring of 2025, Jennifer was invited to speak at the FBI's National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She stood before an audience of investigators, advocates, and families of missing children and told Mark's story. She spoke about the 46 years of not knowing, about the relief of finally having answers even though those answers were heartbreaking. She spoke about forgiveness and resilience and the power of hope even in the darkest circumstances. Her speech ended with a message that resonated throughout the room. She said that Mark's story proved that the truth can survive even decades of concealment, that justice might be delayed but doesn't have to be denied. She said that every cold case represents a family still waiting, still hoping, still deserving of answers. And she said that investigators who keep working these cases, who refuse to let them be forgotten, are heroes to the families who live in the limbo of not knowing. The audience gave her a standing ovation. Several investigators approached her afterward to discuss cases they were working, to ask for her perspective as someone who had lived through decades of uncertainty. Jennifer gave each of them her time and attention, understanding that behind every case file was a family like hers, trapped in a nightmare of questions with no answers. Back in Blackridge, life continued its steady rhythm. Henderson's corner store was still there, though Jim and May Henderson had passed away years earlier, and their grandson ran it now. The building where Mark had bought his last bag of candy looked much the same as it had in 1978. Children still stopped there after school, still counted out their change for candy and sodas, still walked the same streets Mark had walked. But the town was different in ways both visible and invisible. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter. Coaches and teachers underwent background checks. Community awareness programs educated people about the signs of predatory behavior. Mark's disappearance and the revelation of who took him had shattered the illusion that small towns were immune to such evil, but it had also galvanized the community to protect its children more vigilantly. Jennifer planted a tree in Mark's memory at Blackridge Elementary School, a sugar maple that would turn brilliant colors every October. A small plaque at its base read, "In memory of Mark Fulton, may this tree's growth represent hope and healing." Students learned about Mark's story in age-appropriate ways, about the importance of awareness and safety without being taught to live in fear. On October 14, 2025, the 47th anniversary of Mark's disappearance, Jennifer and Robert visited the cemetery. They brought flowers and stood together at Mark's grave, remembering the boy he had been and mourning the man he never got to become. Jennifer traced her fingers over the letters of his name on the headstone and spoke to him as if he could hear, telling him about the changes his case had inspired, about the other families who had found hope in his story. She told him about meeting a woman whose daughter had disappeared in 1982 and had never been found, how they had become friends and supported each other through the unique grief of ambiguous loss. She told him about a cold case in Tennessee that had been solved using new DNA techniques, bringing closure to another family after 30 years. She told him that his case had reminded law enforcement across the country that old cases still mattered, that families were still waiting, that the work of seeking justice never truly ended. As the sun set over Blackridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jennifer felt something she hadn't experienced in 47 years: peace. Not the peace of forgetting or moving on, because a mother never moves on from the loss of her child, but the peace of knowing, the peace of having laid Mark to rest, the peace of understanding that while evil had taken her son, love had proven stronger, keeping Mark's memory alive and ultimately bringing truth to light. She thought about Dale Rucker, about how he had lived with his secret for 15 years after killing Mark. She thought about the journal entries describing his guilt and fear and relief at not being caught. She thought about how he had died believing his crime would stay hidden forever, and she realized that in the end, he had been wrong. The truth had survived his death by 31 years. Mark's story had outlasted the man who tried to bury it. Detective Webb stayed in touch with Jennifer after the case closed. He had worked dozens of cold cases in his career, but Mark's story affected him deeply. He kept a photograph on his desk, not of the crime scene but of Mark's school picture from 1978. The boy smiling at the camera with his whole life ahead of him. It reminded Webb why he did this work, why digging through decades-old evidence and chasing faint leads mattered. He used Mark's case in training seminars, teaching younger detectives about the importance of thorough documentation and the value of revisiting old cases with fresh eyes and new technology. He emphasized how Dale Rucker's position and reputation had provided cover for his crime, how people's natural tendency to trust authority figures could be exploited by predators. And he stressed that justice delayed was not the same as justice denied, that families deserved answers no matter how many years had passed. The maintenance tunnel where Mark had been found was permanently sealed again after the investigation concluded. But this time, a small memorial was placed outside before the concrete was poured. Just a simple brass plate mounted on the rock wall with Mark's name and dates. Nothing dramatic or elaborate, just a quiet acknowledgement that something terrible had happened in that place, and that the truth had finally come to light. Rachel Ortiz, whose decision to investigate the unusual radar readings had led to the discovery, found herself unable to stop thinking about the case. She had worked in construction and mining for 20 years and had seen plenty of difficult things, but finding Mark's resting place had affected her in ways she struggled to articulate. She reached out to Jennifer, wanting to express her condolences and somehow apologize for being the one to bring such painful news. Jennifer met with Rachel and thanked her profusely. She explained that while the discovery had brought pain, it had also brought the gift of closure, the ability to finally mourn properly and say goodbye. She told Rachel that she had often wondered if Mark would ever be found, if she would die still not knowing what happened. Rachel's thoroughness and refusal to overlook anomalous radar readings had given her answers she had sought for 46 years. That was a gift beyond measure. The two women became friends, bonding over their shared connection to Mark's story. Rachel attended the first anniversary memorial service at the cemetery, standing quietly in the back while Jennifer spoke about the year of healing since Mark had been found. Rachel understood that her role in the story was small but significant, a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from simply doing your job with care and attention to detail. In the years following the case's resolution, several true crime documentaries featured Mark's story. Jennifer participated in some, declining others depending on whether she felt they would treat Mark's memory respectfully. She was fierce in protecting her son from being reduced to a sensational headline or exploitative content. The documentaries she approved emphasized the investigative process, the advances in forensic technology, and the importance of never abandoning cold cases. One documentary filmmaker asked Jennifer what she would say to other families living with unsolved disappearances. She thought carefully before responding. She said that hope and realism could coexist, that you could simultaneously hope for the best while preparing yourself for the worst. She said that creating a community of support was essential, that isolation only made the pain worse. She said that finding meaning and purpose, whether through advocacy or art or simply living well, was crucial to surviving the unbearable. But most importantly, she said, never let anyone tell you to give up or move on. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. Love doesn't expire. And the truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, is always worth pursuing. Mark's case proved that answers could come after decades. Other families deserve to hold on to that possibility, that hope, no matter how many years passed. As 2026 began, Jennifer was working on a book about her experience. Not a sensational true crime account, but a memoir about loss and resilience, about carrying hope through decades of uncertainty, about the moment when answers finally came. She wanted other families to know they weren't alone. She wanted to document not just what happened to Mark, but what his disappearance had done to everyone who loved him, and how they had found ways to keep living despite the enormous weight of not knowing. She wrote about Ruth, about how her mother's grief had consumed her final years, about the promise Jennifer had made at her deathbed. She wrote about the marriages that ended and the friendships that frayed under the strain of constant sorrow. She wrote about the detectives who had worked the case over the years, some who had become friends, others who had dismissed it as unsolvable. She wrote about the moment Detective Webb knocked on her door with news she had waited 46 years to hear. And she wrote about Mark, trying to capture on paper the essence of who her son had been in his 9 short years. His kindness and curiosity, his love of reading and terrible jokes, the way he always saved half his Halloween candy to share with his grandmother, the dreams he had talked about, wanting to be a teacher or maybe a veterinarian, the little boy who had walked out the door one October morning and never came home. The book was scheduled for publication in 2027, 49 years after Mark's disappearance. Jennifer hoped it would reach people who needed to hear her message, families trapped in the nightmare of ambiguous loss, investigators working cold cases who needed encouragement to keep going, and anyone who had ever wondered how people survived the unsurvivable. Because that was ultimately what Mark's story represented, survival. Not just Jennifer's survival through decades of not knowing, but the survival of truth itself. Dale Rucker had tried to bury both Mark and the facts of his crime behind concrete and lies. He had succeeded for 46 years, but in the end, truth proved more durable than concrete, more persistent than time, more powerful than a killer's careful plans. The maintenance tunnel had been sealed but not forgotten. The evidence had been hidden but not destroyed. And Mark, whose young life had been stolen by a trusted member of the community, had been missing but never truly lost. His mother's love had kept him present, kept his memory alive, ensured that he remained more than just a name in a cold case file. On what would have been Mark's 56th birthday, Jennifer released balloons at the cemetery, a tradition she had started the year he was found. Blue balloons with yellow ribbons, matching the jacket he had worn that last morning. She watched them rise into the sky, carrying with them messages she had written about love and loss and the long road to peace. Robert stood beside her, understanding that some grief never fully heals but can be transformed into something bearable, even meaningful. The town of Blackridge had changed over the decades since Mark's disappearance. The mine was closed, its tunnels sealed, its buildings repurposed or demolished. Young people moved away, seeking opportunities that coal country could no longer provide. The population had shrunk from 3,000 in 1978 to barely 1,000 in 2026. Henderson's corner store was one of the few constants, still serving the community, still selling candy to children. But Mark's presence remained woven into the fabric of the town, not as a ghost or a tragedy, but as a reminder of vigilance and community responsibility. Parents teaching their children about safety used Mark's story as an example without frightening them. Teachers discussing local history included the case as a turning point when Blackridge lost its innocence but gained awareness. The tree at the elementary school grew taller each year, its roots deepening, its branches spreading, a living monument to a boy who never got to grow up. Jennifer found herself thinking less about the horror of how Mark died and more about the joy of who he had been. She could remember his laughter now without immediately falling into grief. She could look at his photographs and smile at the memories they represented. The discovery of his remains and the knowledge of what had happened had somehow freed her to remember him fully, not just as the missing boy, but as the living child he had once been. She understood that this was what closure meant. Not forgetting, not moving on, but being able to hold the full truth of Mark's life and death simultaneously. The pain didn't disappear, but it no longer dominated every moment. She could carry both the sorrow of his loss and the gratitude for having been his mother. Both truths could exist together, intertwined like the roots of that maple tree, supporting her as she continued forward. Detective Webb retired in 2027, ending a 30-year career in law enforcement. At his retirement party, his colleagues presented him with a framed photograph, the school picture of Mark Fulton that had sat on his desk. They had it mounted along with a quote Jennifer had given them. She had written, "Detective Webb gave our family what 46 years could not, the truth, and with it, the ability to heal." Mark's case was not just a file to him, but a sacred trust, and he honored that trust completely. Webb hung the photograph in his home office, where it served as a reminder of why he had chosen this profession and what good police work could accomplish. He stayed in touch with Jennifer, calling on Mark's birthday and the anniversary of his discovery. They had become unlikely friends, bonded by a case that had ended Webb's career on the highest possible note and had given Jennifer the closure she had desperately needed. As the years continued to pass, Mark's story became part of the larger conversation about cold cases and the importance of never giving up on seeking justice. Legislative changes inspired by his case had real impacts. More old cases were being reviewed with fresh eyes. More bodies were being found. More families were getting the answers they deserved. Mark's death had been a tragedy, but his story's resolution had become a beacon of hope. Jennifer often thought about the randomness of discovery. If Rachel Ortiz hadn't been so thorough, if the mine closure had happened 10 years earlier or 10 years later, if budget cuts had eliminated the requirement to verify old seals, if the radar hadn't shown those particular readings, any of 1,000 small differences might have meant Mark stayed hidden forever, his case remaining unsolved, his mother dying without ever knowing what happened. But the universe, fate, God, whatever force guided such things, had aligned to bring truth to light. At the exact right moment, with the exact right people, in the exact right circumstances, Mark had been found. Jennifer chose to see meaning in that timing. Ruth had died, still not knowing, but Jennifer, who had to carry the burden of advocacy and memory for all those years, had lived to see resolution. Perhaps that was how it was meant to be. She also thought about Dale Rucker, about whether he had lived his final years in fear that his crime would somehow be discovered. Had he worried when new technology emerged? Had he watched news stories about old cases being solved with DNA and ground-penetrating radar and wondered if his time was running out? Or had he truly believed, as his journal suggested, that his secret would outlive him? Jennifer would never know the answers to those questions, just as she would never know what had gone through Dale's mind in those final moments of Mark's life. Some mysteries remained even after the central question had been answered. But she had learned to accept that not every question needed an answer. Knowing what happened to Mark, where he had been, who had taken him, that was enough. The rest was just details that would torture her if she let them. In the spring of 2028, exactly 50 years after Mark's disappearance, Blackridge held a community memorial service. 50 years felt significant, a half-century milestone that deserved acknowledgement. The service was held at the cemetery, with chairs set up around Mark's grave for the expected crowd. Jennifer was surprised by how many people came. Former residents who had moved away returned for the occasion. Strangers who had followed the case made the pilgrimage to pay their respects. The media showed up, though Jennifer had requested they remain respectful and distant. She spoke briefly, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. She thanked everyone for never forgetting Mark, for keeping his story alive, for proving that one small boy's life mattered. She thanked the investigators who had worked the case over the decades, particularly Detective Webb, who had finally brought it to resolution. She thanked Rachel Ortiz for her thoroughness, and she thanked the community of Blackridge for their support through 5 decades of pain. Then she did something unexpected. She thanked Dale Rucker's family, who had attended the service despite knowing how painful their presence might be. She thanked them for their courage in facing the truth, for not hiding from what Dale had done, for reaching out with compassion and apology, even though his crimes were not their fault. She said that Dale's actions had devastated multiple families, and that healing required acknowledging everyone's pain, even the pain of the killer's relatives who had been victimized by his deceptions. Carol Rucker stood, trembling, and walked to Jennifer. The 2 women embraced while cameras clicked and people wept. It was a moment of grace and forgiveness that transcended the horror that had brought them together. They stood there, holding each other, 2 elderly women bound by tragedy but choosing compassion over bitterness. The service concluded with the planting of 50 tulip bulbs around Mark's grave, 1 for each year since his disappearance. Jennifer said that when they bloomed each spring, they would represent renewal and hope, the promise that beauty could emerge even from the darkest soil. Volunteers dug small holes and placed the bulbs carefully, creating a circle of future flowers around the marker that bore Mark's name. As people dispersed, Jennifer remained at the grave with Robert. They sat on a bench nearby, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Jennifer thought about all the years, all the tears, all the prayers that had brought her to this moment. She thought about 9-year-old Mark, walking toward Henderson's corner store with quarters in his hand and his whole life ahead of him. She thought about the mother she had been then, happy and hopeful, unaware that her world was about to shatter. And she thought about who she had become: a survivor, an advocate, a voice for families trapped in the nightmare of not knowing. Mark's death had not been in vain. His story had changed laws, improved investigations, brought hope to countless families. His brief life had cast a long shadow, but that shadow contained light, evidence that love persisted, that truth endured, that justice, however delayed, could still be achieved. Robert took her hand and they sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had learned that healing was not a destination but a journey. The pain of Mark's loss would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed from an open wound into a scar, still sensitive but no longer bleeding. Jennifer could live with that. After 50 years, she had earned the right to peace, and she claimed it without guilt or hesitation. As darkness fell over Blackridge, lights began to appear throughout the cemetery. People were returning, carrying candles in small glass jars. They placed them around Mark's grave, dozens and then hundreds of flickering flames, creating a constellation of light in the darkness. No one had organized this. It happened spontaneously, a community gesture of remembrance and solidarity. Jennifer watched the lights multiply and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. This was what Mark's legacy had become. Not just the policy changes and investigative improvements, though those mattered enormously, but this, people coming together in the darkness to light candles for a boy they had never met, proving that compassion and community could survive even the most terrible circumstances. She picked up one of the candles and held it close, watching the flame dance in the evening breeze. Somewhere out there, in other towns and cities, other families were living through their own versions of this nightmare. Other children were missing. Other mothers were waiting for answers that might not come for decades. But because of Mark's story, those families had reason to hope. They knew that cases could be solved 50 years later. They knew that truth could survive even the most careful concealment. They knew that they were not alone. Jennifer placed her candle next to all the others, adding her light to the collective glow. Mark Andrew Fulton, born October 3, 1969, disappeared October 14, 1978, found September 18, 2024. 9 years of life, 46 years of mystery, and finally, eternal peace. His story was complete. His mother could rest. And the truth, that resilient and precious thing that Dale Rucker had tried so hard to bury, shone brightly in the Kentucky night, a beacon for anyone who still believed that justice and closure were worth fighting for, no matter how long the fight might take. The town of Blackridge would continue on, its population dwindling as the coal economy faded into history. But Mark's story would remain, passed down through generations, a reminder of both the darkness humans were capable of and the persistence of those who refused to let truth stay buried. It was a story about loss and love, about patience and perseverance, about a mother who never gave up and a community that never forgot. And it was a story that proved beyond any doubt that some secrets cannot stay hidden forever, that concrete walls and careful lies are no match for time and truth, that justice, however delayed, we can still find its way home.